So I'm Keith Marzilli Ericson, and I'm going to talk with you about consumer welfare and the objective of the firm. So if we think about the theory of the firm, a fundamental question is what firms should maximize. Standard model, firms maximize profits, but here we are talking about ESG objectives and thinking about the role of ESG. Why do shareholders have these preferences about firms? Well, shareholders are also consumers, so they care how a firm treats its consumers, the people who buy its product. Shareholders also have social preferences. They care about other people, and hence they care about how firms treat other people. Consumer welfare is a social objective, the S in ESG, part of that S. Yet pricing is typically ignored in the discussion of ESG and corporate social responsibility. Lower prices are a unique technology that firms have access to in order to promote consumer welfare. Yet, and economists know a lot about the structure of this technology, having studied profit maximization. And so if we think about the objective of the firm, we can lay out a very standard profit maximization objective, quantity, which is a function of price, Q of P, times price minus cost, profits. And we could augment that with some weight on consumer welfare that shareholders might want firms to place. So that's going to be lambda times CW, consumer welfare. Now, when we have profit maximization, I didn't derive this formula, standard classic formula for price. If lambda is equal to 0, no weight on consumer welfare, price equals cost plus a markup term that depends on the demand curve. Okay, well, what happens when we add a weight on consumer welfare? Lambda is greater than 0, we're going to get lower prices. Price equals cost plus that markup term, but that markup term is downweighted by lambda, 1 minus lambda. So bigger lambda, less markup over costs. And so that weight, the weight that shareholders would like firms to place on consumers matters for how firms set prices, and we can think about how then that impacts consumer well-being. So how do we know what we're here measuring things. How do we know what shareholders want firms to do? We can elicit shareholder preferences via votes, strategic votes. And so that's what I did here, recruit an approximately representative sample of the US, about 435 individuals, and have them answer strategic survey questions about how you would vote on a firm strategy. So shareholders would like to give guidance to managers, and you have a choice between voting to maximize profits or setting prices lower, giving up $1 million in profits for X million in consumer benefits. And we can vary X a lot. And then that would give us an estimate of each individual shareholder's desired lambda, weight on consumer benefits. The median lambda in our sample is 0.25, which means that the median shareholder is willing to give up $25 in profits to transfer $100 in benefits to consumers. And indeed, firms have access to that technology. When you're profit maximizing, small declines in prices have big benefits to consumers and tiny impacts on profits. So firms can implement this desired lambda. Moreover, when we look at it, well, we can see how many people want firms to simply maximize profits and ignore consumer well-being, and that's a small slice of our sample, about 12%. So we find that shareholders want firms to place a weight on consumer well-being, and we can look at our data and show how that varies by various observable characteristics of each shareholder, because there's heterogeneity. They don't all agree. So higher income, gender, amount of stock held. That weight is in fact sizable, and we can think about its size in two different ways. One way is to compare it to something else that we're here talking a lot about, which is the desired impact on the environment. Using that same strategic survey question methodology, we can do trade-offs, ask shareholders about trade-offs between profits and avoiding environmental damage and placing a dollar amount on that. We can elicit then a desired weight on environmental benefits and compare that to our desired weight on on consumer welfare. Good news for this conference is that people also care about the environment, and in fact, they care about the environment more than they care about consumers, so the weight on the environment is about twice that on consumer well-being. This method, more broadly, provides guidance to firms. Firms want to represent their owners' interests and implement them. So how do they do that without knowing what shareholders want firms to do? And these kind of strategic survey questions are a way to do that. Other asset managers, mutual funds also need to vote on behalf of the people who own the underlying assets. And how do they do that without, again, knowing what what shareholders would like firms to do. This method, I think, provides information on consumer welfare and shareholders' desired weight on that, but can be used more broadly to identify shareholders' broader objectives. That's all for today.